great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dolores Cucina Musina, otherwise referred to as Dr. OTA. She is absolutely the subject matter expert in other transactions authority. She's been in this industry for more than a decade, doing a lot of things in terms of innovative solutions, providing strategy, helping with compliance. She's really done it all. She has a PhD in public administration and policy as well from Old Dominion. Is that correct, Dolores? Old Dominion University. She has all kinds of certifications and things like federal contract management. She is brilliant. We are so thrilled to have her and to call her a friend of the Pulse. And she has so generously offered her time to join us today for this session. A little bit about Dolores's company, Rexota Solutions. They were established 3 years ago. They focus on driving cross-sector collaboration and innovation and policy transformation. As Dolores would say, they are grounded in practicality, using unique skill sets, and applying measurable rigor to revolutionize the acquisition process. We all know the acquisition process has its flaws. Rexota is here trying to make it better. So if you have questions about Rexota or would like more information, Dolores will provide some of that contact information at the end. So with that, Dolores, I'm going to turn it over to you. We are thrilled to hear from you.
All right, thank you so much for the intro. So thank you everyone for joining today to hear about other transaction authorities. As promised on LinkedIn, if you saw my post last week, we will not be starting out with the ever beginning legend of OTAs of 1958, but we will probably touch on to it because it is important to understand the basis and what everything is formed from. I will share just how I got into OTAs and why I have earned the nickname of Dr. OTA. I wrote my dissertation on other transaction authorities and measuring its effectiveness, showing that there's several factors that we need to look in when we're looking at the statute and we're looking at, is it really working? Because that's really the question that we're after, right? Are they working? Are they being used for their purpose? My journey started in 2018 when it was really, really popular to talk about OTAs and it started becoming the sexy topic. And I was at a NCMA conference, their GCMS conference. And I went to a session and everyone was talking about OTAs and they're like, oh my gosh, it's a new sexy thing. It's so exciting. I was like, ooh, this is interesting. I might be interested in doing this. I was working in the traditional contract space, trying to figure out, is there something else? And so OTAs became very attractive to me. The FAR was something that was like, you knew it, it was there, you could Google it, you had the institutional knowledge of the FAR or federal acquisition regulations, but I felt like there had to be other options. There had to be something else. And so when I heard about this sexy new thing called OTAs, I was like, I need to figure this out. Literally the next hour, I went to another session where the presenters said, we don't know why we're calling this the new sexy thing. They've been around since 1958. This is old news. And I'm like, this is even better. There's a bunch of confusion as to, is it sexy and new? Is it old and established? What is going on here? And at that point, I had decided this is going to be my research topic. I saw Congress had a lot of questions about it. And I got connected to a lot of mentors and a lot of people in the community that showed me the way, but also showed me that there's different approaches when we're talking about OTAs. So my journey for the past, I don't know, 6 to 8 years, whatever it may be, has all led me to this. And I continue to do research with my research partner, Ben McMartin, on the comparison study, which we'll get into in a minute. But this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I love that curiosity is just staying within this topic. So let's jump right into it. Next slide. All right, this is a really fun slide for me just to share, just to ground everyone on where we are. So federal acquisition pathways, you have your FAR and you have your non-FAR pathways. Most of us live in this magenta, purplish color. We're very familiar with it. We understand what a letter contract is. We know what simplified acquisitions is. We understand, you know, what a BAA is or an BPA is, what are commercial solutions openings. All of this stuff, we hear about it every single day. Where I like to live is in the lime green section, which is the unknown territory, or, you know, if you're a fan of The Lion King, right? Like, this belongs to you, everything the sun touches. And I'm in that dark part and the shadowy part where nobody wants to look at. And so really talking about like, what are the agreements that help foster innovation, that help foster research and development, and remembering that it's not a linear path. And so the unknown, the creativity behind this lime green area really, really excites me because it provides a lot of discretion and a lot of creative solution making within the acquisition world, within the policy world. But it also creates a lot of confusion and a lot of gray areas because whenever there's discretion, it's hard for people to have a black and white answer to certain questions. So one of my favorite responses is it depends. You will hear me say it a lot, especially, if you drop a question into the chat. And Amanda, I'm sure during the session, when you ask me a question, I'll most likely answer with the fun, it depends, and then give you some fun examples. Yep, let's go to the next slide. Let's jump right into it. So what are other transaction authorities? Other transaction authorities are there to help promote getting things done. In other words, how do we get leading technology into the hands of the federal government, providing a flexible and goal-oriented method? So when we look at OTAs, we hear the legend, right, of the Space Act and how it all came about, and that this was really needed for the government to have flexibility to contract with industry in a different way. You're hearing that conversation now. You heard this conversation in the 1980s and the 1990s. This is a constant barrier that the government's trying to get over, which is how do we get more industry to do business with us? In 2017, 2018, GAO came out with a report saying that OTAs are the way to bring in innovative companies, and they promoted for government to use it more because there were so many companies that did not want to do business with the government. The reason why they didn't want to do business with the government is the reason that you see of what does not apply to OTAs. And it wasn't to try to bypass these regulations. It was because of the cost that's associated with standing it up. For anyone that's a small business or even a large business that has tried to stand up a cost accounting system within their company, and you feel the pain of having to do this. In that GAO report that I just referenced, and I'm happy to share the link to it as well. I believe the number that one of the companies had attributed to the cost of standing up a compliant certified cost accounting system was nearly $2.5 million. Now, based on the size of the company, of course, that makes sense. But I've even heard of, tens and thousands of dollars being spent by small companies just trying to figure out what they need. And that includes like the consultants that you bring in, that includes the software system that you're buying, the licenses, the policy changes that you're doing, and all the overhead that goes into creating these policies and procedures. Other things that don't apply, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, do not apply to other transaction authorities or any of its supplements. The FAR is very sneaky. It does try to sneak in there sometimes. And some of I've seen it in solicitations, I've seen it in contracts, I've seen it in sub-agreements that prime stuff flow down to their subcontractors. It does not belong there. The FAR does have some great clauses that you can leverage for language, but there should not be a 52 dot anything or 252 or any of the other supplements that are sneakily into that agreement. So if you see it, call it out, ask the question, and really ask, what is the reason that this clause is in here? Other things that don't apply, the Bayh-Dole Act does not apply. The Buy American Act, again, in part, there's some legislature that does play into this. And then mandatory flow downs to subcontractors. So being aware of what applies to OTAs and what doesn't is really important. And what you'll hear a lot of other OTA experts say is that OTAs are not defined for what they are. They're more defined by what they are not. And that is because sometimes it's easier to know what you don't want versus knowing what you want. Next slide.
Dolores, before you move through, do you find that government folks will push back when you point out that this piece from the FAR isn't supposed to be here, this is not applicable? Do they tend to fight you on it, or is there enough of a gray area is not the right term, but potentially a lack of understanding that they're like, oh no, my bad, that probably shouldn't be there?
So I will say what I find most of the time, if government is putting that clause in there, they don't necessarily push back. As long as you have really good justification for why. And just saying like the FAR doesn't belong in OTAs isn't great. It is enough to substantiate it, and you can show the policy guides. But you can go back and you can say, hey, this clause, it looks like a FAR clause. My understanding is, the FAR does not apply to OTAs. What are we trying to achieve here? And whether that's in the solicitation, you can ask the question, right? Catch it early on. You guys know this. If there's something wrong with the solicitation, catch it early on, ask it in the Q&A, try to make adjustments. And then if you see it in the contract, the whole beauty of OTAs is that the agreements are negotiable, and you're supposed to have open communications with your agreements officer. So it's a really great, what I say, test of the relationship to push back. And even with large primes, I have not seen a lot of pushback as long as you have really good justification, and also an alternative. So if someone sticks a FAR clause in there, try to read it and think why that might be in there. It's probably because that clause is language that they want to reference, but they don't know necessarily how to edit out all of the FAR references, so it's easier to copy and paste. And it's the familiar. Going back and saying, hey, I see a FAR clause in here. What is the intent that you're trying to achieve? How about this language? Would you be willing to do this? I've also seen where you can tell that the FAR is being referenced, but they drop the number and then they don't actually clean up the text. Help them out. Clean out those references. That you can see there is an attempt made. But there's really good clauses in the FAR, and you can leverage that. Just don't make sure you do a very clean job. And if you're pushing back on the government or your prime on those FAR or DFAR clauses or any supplement, you also provide an alternative, because a lot of times the drafting of new clauses comes from legal. And if anyone has had to work in an organization and had to work directly with their general counsel, getting on the calendar with your legal is just a lot. So just to help them out on the other side a little bit, I always recommend to provide some sample language.
That is great insight. Thank you.
All right. So OTAs are not, I don't like the term wild, wild west, because it's not. There are still some regulations that apply. It is not a free all where you don't have to follow the laws at all. There's still laws that apply. So you still have to follow, criminal law. You can't commit, treason under an OTA. You can't sell illegal substances under an OTA. You can't, for example, pay people under minimum wage. So using some common sense when it comes to OTAs, when it comes to laws. Also just being aware of other requirements like FedRAMP would apply to OTAs. It is not, the caveat here is it shouldn't be flowed down as a FAR or DFARS clause, similar to CMMC. You would probably flow down the NIST regulations. So there's aspects that you still have to follow when it comes to OTAs. So I really don't like the term wild, wild west, because there's still bounds that you have to operate under, and you still have to keep some of the, contract law principles when you're drafting these agreements. But when it comes to traditional procurement versus OTAs, a lot of the regulations that are subject to the FAR or are as a result of the FAR, those would not necessarily apply to OTAs. All right. Let me show you a whole new world of OTAs. This slide, this is the comparison study that I had referred to. The beauty of this slide, where it started, just so that you have some appreciation for the work that went into this, is in 2018, 2019, I was working on my dissertation, and I was reading the DoD statutes, and I was digging through everything. And then I got put on a project to respond to an HHS solicitation using one of their OTA statutes. You can see they have a pretty good amount. And what happened was I realized there was a lot of differences between what the HHS statute and the NIH statute says versus what DoD. So called my research partner. I said, hey, so I need your help. You've given me a lot of guidance on DoD, but now it looks like HHS and NIH is a little different, it's a little wonky. What can we do here, and how, and what does this mean? And of course, as any good mentor, he said, well, why don't you start with a comparison and put something together, and then let's look at it and we'll examine what the differences are. Then I said, great. I started researching and started discovering all of these other fun OT authorities, started comparing it to the NASA authority, and it led to part of what this contains. And it has grown every single year. I think every 6 months we update this slide with new updates, because it's an ever-changing world. So these are all of the authorities that are out as of today that I have found, and that Ben McMartin have found. We have, man, since I think the fiscal year 23 NDAA, there was about 3 authorities that were announced, and clarifications that were announced. And then the CHIPS Act was really big on OTA authorities. So over the last 3 years, we have seen a vast increase, not only in people wanting the authority, but people establishing it or testing it and trying it out. One of the fun things that I love about the OTAs is that some of them will go ahead and leverage other agency authorities. So for example, Department of Homeland Security leverages the DoD authority, which they have finally updated their statutes. It no longer references 845 agreements. Yes, they have finally updated it to 4022 and 4021. But then you have other agencies that are still referencing some of the old statutes that need to be updated. So they are in here, ones that are referencing other regulations and statutes. We try to catch those. We also try to catch any guides, any other policy directives that might be out there. And not all of them are the same. Department of Defense tends to have, in my opinion, the most descriptive authority in terms of including instructions, directions, guidance. They now have 2 other transaction guides that are out there, one for research and development, which is 4021, and one for prototyping, which is 4022. They came out last year. If you don't have copies of them, I'll get them over to you guys at the Pulse so that you have those to distribute for anyone that has questions. So there's been a lot of conversation, and a lot of the presentations that are done on other transactions are mostly based on the DoD authority, which makes you wonder why, because there's so many. And the reason why is because DoD uses it a lot more. They spend a lot more money through their authority. So they are the cool kid in school when it comes to OTs, and they're growing and they're learning. And there's a large team of people that is very committed within DoD, and a lot of agreements officers that want to do right, and others that are also trying to learn and pick up the pace as much as they can, knowing the importance of OTs. So just if you're looking for frame of reference of why am I here and how can I leverage this, you are here because this is a much more expansive world other than just the NASA authority and the DoD authority. There's a lot of other agencies that are using this. All right, let's do a deep dive in, unless Amanda, you have any questions on this one.
So I do have one actually. Haley, I don't know about you, but when we were preparing for this slide in particular shocked me, because when you get into places like SAM and you run reports on OTs, you see DoD, you see NASA, and you sometimes see DHS, but that's about it. So, if you don't know this landscape, you may be like me under the assumption that only those folks have OT authority, when really it's a really significant landscape. How is the government tracking any of this information? Do you know where they're hiding it, that we're not seeing it?
Oh my gosh, you asked my favorite question. So reporting, I am a huge advocate for transparency and data, because as an academic, I want the data, I want to see it, I want to measure, I want to look at it. So one thing that I had discovered during my dissertation research, for example, for DoD, only the prototype OTs are reported. The 4021 OTs are not reported. They're actually treated like cooperative agreements and grants. So they are tracked in an internal system. And in the DoD guide, they actually tell you the two separate systems, which they've now changed for 4021. That's been updated to a new one. It used to be, I think, DADC. Now it's a whole different system that they have to report on. And FPDS tracks everything that's in 4022, as long as it's reported in there. The caveat here is that it's not always clear if it's prototype or if it's follow-on. So if you see a lot of reports talking about follow-on OTs within DoD, use a little like question mark to know how did they differentiate it, did they dig down into the agreements to see if that was the case. Other agencies are really trying to go ahead and report within FPDS and make their data available. A lot of it is for transparency, to answer the call that Congress has of, hey, we want to see how they're being used, and make it, and have easy reporting. The problem is not all of them. This is something I found out, I think, a year and a half ago. Not all of them have the option to select their OT authority to report in FPDS. So they have to request it from FPDS in order for them to do the reporting like they need to. Now, I don't know what on the back end, what that looks like or what those approvals are. I know I've talked to a few agencies that have asked me, how do they report in FPDS and how do they get to, because they haven't been able to get that, this is probably the wrong word, but permissions in FPDS to report it. SAM.gov, I would say, is a great tool set. There, from the last time that I compared the data set in SAM versus FPDS, FPDS has a more complete record than SAM. They have been talking for a long time of transferring everything in FPDS to SAM. Now that I'm done with my dissertation, they can do that. But before, it really made me panic because we all saw what happened with SAM.gov beta. And so I was definitely in a panic to see when that data comes through. The other thing is FPDS is about 6 months behind on that data going live. So if you're looking for something that happened last month, you may not see it in there. You may see it in June. So a lot of times, anything that you're looking for that is at the end of, let's say, fiscal year 23, you wouldn't get that data until about January or February of 2024. So just be aware that there is also a lag of data. The other thing is anything that's research and development tends to be treated as grants, cooperative agreements. Sometimes it's tracked in USA spending. Sometimes it's tracked internally. So NASA, for example, reports a lot of their data on their website. It is within their statute that they do it. And you can actually pull the report. They have a really great spreadsheet that you can download to see what they're doing and how they're leveraging their OT authority, down to how much the funding is. They may not have a description that might be overly detailed as to what that agreement was for. But in some instances, they give a little bit more visibility than FPDS does to what the OT agreements are being leveraged for. And they give you even the obligated amount and the used amount sometimes. So sometimes they post it to their website. Sometimes it's an FPDS. Sometimes it's internal. Sometimes if you're an Office Space fan, it's the guy that's sitting in the bottom of the basement with his red stapler that's doing the report for the entire agency himself. I've heard that story over and over again, that there's this one person that's somewhere in the agency and he's the only one that's reporting, or she's the only one that's keeping track of all of these agreements. So this is something in an area where I think is really important and to pay attention to. But if you're like, where's the data? You're going to have to look at multiple sources. You're going to have to do a lot of digging to find it. It is not as easy as going to SAM or FPDS just to pull it up.
Haley, did you make a note of all of those laundry list of places we need to start looking for this stuff?
Absolutely, I did.
Another question that came in the Q&A. Can you summarize kind of the key differences between the R&D authority and the prototype demonstration OT authority?
Yeah, so we'll do a deep dive in a few authorities just for you to see what some of the differences are. So research and development authority, the way that this is distinguished here is that the statute itself references just research and development. The second, I guess, version of it is the prototype deployment demonstration OT authority. Not every agency uses prototype authority. Some of them use demonstration, some of them use deployment, some of them use just use research and development to mean both, which is where it gets tricky in finding all of these statutes and trying to figure out which one applies to what. You really have to read the language to really understand what it's being leveraged for. And in some instances, also these statutes can be used in a more expansive way than what's written in black and white because there is such discretion that's associated with these agreements. For example, there was a solicitation, I think, from HHS that was specifically for a software in support of their research and development. But if you look at NIH's and HHS's OT authorities, they are very specific as to what kind of research you can do. Nothing in there says this is for software or this is, for products that are in support of the research. So somewhere in there, legal found that gray area to use the authority and to leverage it. And they use the authority that they technically would call their research and development, but they're able to prototype the way that we think of prototyping a software to help with their research and also integrate into a lot of their other systems. So what you see in the way that it's divided is, I would say, coding by the researchers to say this is research and development, this is prototype demonstration. There might be another academic that's doing a comparison study like this and may distinguish them separately. But because all of these authorities are so different, it was good for us to divide them into maybe like two sectors so people can see that they're used very differently between all the agencies.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Sean, I do see your follow-on question. I'm going to hold it while we dive deeper into some of the specific statutes and then come back to it if it's still there.
All right. Oh, this is perfect. We just talked about data. So I want to talk about the Inspector General reports. These make a ton of noise, just like protests in the OTA world. Federal agency audits and reports, they are like the People magazine of the acquisition world, right? They are where people come in and they're like, ooh, I need to know what the gossip is. What's going on? What are people doing wrong? What are the recommendations? These are just some of the reports. I think there's been a couple more that have come out. What I really like about this slide and why I try to harp on this slide a lot is if you look at the questions that are being asked from FFA, HHS, and DHS in terms of how they're using their authority, their question is very exact in the sense of that they're asking, are we using this in accordance with the authority? And then if you look at the Department of Defense IG reports, there's a very different spin in terms of how we're looking at OT authorities, and what we're saying is the measure of success. And a lot of it is focused on one, consortiums, and the other one is use of non-traditionals. But, if we're looking at the effectiveness of something, we need to look at the factors in the statute. Additionally, the other thing that I really want to bring your attention to is the sample size that is being used for each of these reports. This is important when we're talking about data. So if there's any data analytics type people that are out there or nerds like me, the first thing that I go to is I look, what are these results based off of and how much of the actual data set was used to make these recommendations or used to write this report. And what you will find is that it is not a very large number. It is, you're looking at a sample of 63 OT agreements out of 762. That's a small percentage when you look at it. Another one that made a lot of noise in 2022 was the second one from the bottom, DOG 2022-094, which was looking at prototype agreements and how they were awarded. they only looked at 36 prototype OTs out of 889 prototype OTs, right? And so we're making big recommendations on these statutes and these guidance and these policies based on a small number that is actually being reviewed. Now, do I have an expectation that someone out there is going to read 889 prototype OTs? Absolutely not. But we also know that to do a really good academic study, that is not a large enough percentage, and that is not a good enough sample in order for you to have any statistical significance or for you to draw any real conclusions from the actual population that you're using. So I always say, keep your eye open, ask the question if it doesn't make sense. Now, I'm not dismissing the recommendations that are in these reports. They are really good observations. There are really good recommendations here. But when we make a lot of noise about some of these findings and some of these studies, we have to ask ourselves, what is the validity of the data? What is the goodness factor of the data? And are we making a decision based off of something that's substantial enough to show that we had a large enough sample for us to look at to make those conclusions? And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir to any academics that are out there that are like, oh my God, only 3% of the total population was used to make these determinations. Yeah, 3 to 5% was the average for a lot of these IG reports. So I think that's a really fun statistic in terms of when we're looking at some of these large documents of really assessing what does this have to do with the actual landscape and the environment that we're working in.
Dolores, a moment to shout out your new book. Someone has asked, is this level of detail also in that book?
This level of detail, no, it's not to this level. So the book is meant to be a primer for people that are not familiar with the innovation space and all of the contracts and agreements that go in to support it. There is a case study that's included in there that does go very much into depth of measuring effectiveness for OTs, of course. And then there's also really good information on, how do you look at relationships when it comes to forming like a public-private partnership, for example, and what is some of the institutional knowledge that went behind forming some of the statutes and policies that we have now. So it's more of to get you ready and get everyone prepared for this level of detail. And not to give away any secrets, but there's a couple things that are in the works to dive into some of these very nuanced pieces that will be coming maybe next year or the following year.
Your beach reading is on its way, folks. Coming.
All right, our deep dive. Let's see, let's do a time check. All right, we have enough time. We're gonna glide through these. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'm gonna go through these semi-quickly. So Department of Homeland Security, OTA, they have two. Shocking, because guess what they leverage? They leverage the DoD authority with some modification, just to make sure that that they capture the changes that are applicable to their own department. One thing to take away from this is that DHS does have a guide. I actually, after I made the slide, I found a more updated guide. So they updated their guide in 2023. And they do have a directive as well that people follow. And DHS is doing a lot of really fun stuff with their OT authority. You can actually find their OT agreements data in FPDS. DHS is one of the agencies that does have it. They have actually a pretty good data set in there. I wouldn't say that everything is tracked in there, again, because they do leverage the DoD authority. So I'm sure they treat their R&D OTs similarly to DoD, where they're tracked internally, but all of their prototypes are tracked in there. Again, you'll see a lot of similarities, and we'll get to the DoD authority at the end. But just for you to know, the R&D OT, it's basic applied advanced research in assistance to broaden the DHS technology base. This is a very broad purpose and use. You can see where the gray area stuff comes into play, right? If you're on the legal and policy side, you're like, well, what does that mean, broaden? Like, is that truly like innovative? Is it new to me? Does that mean dual use? Does this mean commercially available technology? My answer is it depends. It depends on how your scope is written. It depends on what your legal and your policy approves. But definitely starting to work with them early is very important if you're on the government side. Everything else here, you know, if you've been following the OT world, you still have to follow, you know, the same requirements that you will see in the prototype DoD OT authority. Cost share is a big question for a lot of people. So just to help clarify this piece, cost share does not mean just money. It does not mean that if the government is, you know, if you're doing 30% of it, then the government's doing, you know, 60% of it or 90% of it, it's all monetary. It could be in other things like resources, knowledge, facilities. It does not have to be just the dollar sign. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at cost share, especially if you're a non-traditional, you do not have to cost share. And we'll get into the definition of non-traditional defense contractor as well when we get to the DoD authority, because there's been a lot of questions about that one. I would say that one is the unknown definition, and it tends to be misused a lot. But it's broad for a reason. It was changed for a reason. So we'll jump into that as well. All right, next slide. All right, NIH has 3 authorities that you can see what I meant by saying they are very specific. Heart, lung, and blood program, Cures Acceleration Network. What does this all mean? How is it used? Each authority in itself provides you the purpose that pertains to each one. So demonstration in this instance is not how we, you know, a lot of agencies will use the term demonstration, and it's, I think, to translate it to the DoD authority can be construed as the prototype authority. But it's to demonstrate that you can actually perform the work. So it's making sure that you can demonstrate, these projects can demonstrate your knowledge of biological, behavioral, social sciences, and it's expansive again, right? There's a lot of things that can fit into this if you read this with a very objective mind. The program authority for heart, lung, and blood program, you know, again, it's very much focused on heart, blood vessel, lung, and blood disease. But there's a lot of things that are specific to that prevention. It is not just the heads down doing the research. There's a lot of resources that someone could be providing, software, supplies. There could be a new technology to help advance that research that someone might not be thinking of. And testing that might be required for it, where this authority can be used. The Cures Acceleration Network OT Authority, again, that one is very specific in developing high-need cures, including through development of medical products and behavioral therapies. Very broad again. It sounds very specific, but you can fit a lot into this authority and its purpose. Any special requirements? So there are certain pieces that you want to keep track of. When it comes to the demonstration authority, they have to be obligated under 42 USC 282 AB. That's a mouthful. And you have to give special consideration. This demonstration OTs, I think, is actually the authority for the solicitation that I referenced earlier. That was very specific, where they fit in the software that they needed to buy in support of their research. Nowhere in here did you see something that said, you know, you need to demonstrate that your software works. You know, it's something that's in support of what they're doing and in support of all of the research areas that they're performing. For each of these authorities, there is a guide that NIH has, and they are public. You can find them online. HHS right now is actually updating their guide, from what I heard. It was one of my favorite OT guides. It was over 500 pages, but it had some really good nuggets in there. Not only did they explain the statute, they provided their training slides for anyone that was reading it. They provided guidance in their guide. They provided several sample agreements, which was really, really helpful for a lot of agreements officers and HHS to use that and use that as a basis. So we'll see what happens with the new guide, but I'm really, really excited about that one. All right, next slide. And I'm flying through these because I know we'll have some good Q&A at the end. All right, this is the popular kid in school, the Department of Defense Authority. If you don't know the legend of this, 1989, DARPA got their OT authority to do research and development. People went in front of Congress and asked for this authority because guess what they needed? They needed more participation from industry and from innovative companies that they wanted to bring in to do business with the government that didn't want to do it. So Congress granted DARPA the OT authority, and in early 90s, they granted the rest of DoD this authority as well. Later, we saw Section 845 agreements, which was the predecessor to 2371B, which is now 4022. And the follow-on production as well in 2018 was added on when it was codified. So the development of this authority has, I would say, has been in the news, has been popular, and a lot of people have been tracking the development of these statutes because we all track the DoD budget, we all track the National Defense Acquisition Act, we all track what is happening with spending every single fiscal year at the end and in the beginning, because Department of Defense is known to fund a lot of innovation and they have the biggest budget for it. So they are the popular kid in school, which there's a lot of eyes on them. So a lot of the studies are focused on their statute. Again, for data, just a reminder, their data is an FPDS, but only for the prototype authority, and you're not able to distinguish between prototype and production. There should be an option to do that. There was a call for action for that 2 years ago, but that has not happened in FPDS, and I have not seen it notated in notes, but I think it's because it's also hard to manage. Similar to what you saw with DHS, the R&D OT authority is for basic, applied, and advanced research. Your prototype authority is directly relevant to enhancing mission effectiveness of improving platform system components and materials. And last year's NDAA actually ended up adding a, what is it called? A pilot program for construction. So this NDAA for fiscal year 24 added that into the definition that construction is now can be used for prototype OTs. They are sunsetting the pilot program in 2025, which is kind of weird that they only did it for 3 years. But that one has been like a really fun anomaly for me to track. I don't know anyone that's working on a project using this authority for construction, but if you know someone, let me know because I really want to talk to them and see how they're leveraging it. I know the construction need has been around for a long time. I think since 2016, people have been trying to leverage OT authorities for construction and to help build up some new facilities within DoD. But now they have it in the NDAA, but it's taken a really long time to get in there. Follow-on production. This one is also a really fun one to me where it's unclear. Most people think that if you have the prototype OT, you should be just leveraging the follow-on production OT as well. If you've been following the protests, it has been a lot has been around this follow-on production aspect of it. Just remember, you do not have to go with an OT for follow-on production after your prototype OT. You might decide on a different instrument. You might decide to go the traditional route and do a FAR procurement contract. So for follow-on, just keep in mind, there's a lot of options, especially if you've shown that you have a successful prototype. And the success of your prototype is defined within your agreement. So make sure you have that language in your agreement. Let me see, what else is there really fun to cover with the DoD authority? Trying to think.
Can I throw a question at you?
Yeah.
So I know in the fall, to your point of moving from the prototyping into production, DoD announced, guidance feels like a strong word, but essentially the intention to provide greater support for things like prototype OTs and SIBRs to get those things that are successful in prototyping through to production and actual acquisition. How are you tracking that as it relates to OTs?
That's a great question. So it's really hard to track, and I'm trying to figure out a good method to track it. The reason why it's really hard to track is because it doesn't necessarily always have to be a new agreement to go from prototype to follow-on. Some people have done it as a simple modification to the agreement to turn it into follow-on. This was the case. I know the first time I heard about that, people doing that was like in 2019. I don't know if with the new guidance and with the new guide, if that is still an option. There's nothing in the guide that says you can't do it. So I like the rule of if it doesn't say you can't, you can. But it's really hard to track. Sometimes in FPDS, they will put in there that it's a follow-on, but it's very rare. I have talked to some folks about reporting and maybe creating a new PID, which is the contract number. So the 9th digit, if it's a 9, you know it's a prototype agreement, an OT prototype agreement. If it's the 9th digit in your contract number, that's how you can easily spot an OT. And everybody uses that, but there's not going to be a different number for follow-on. For research, it's the number 3. So you'll know it's a research OT if there's a 3 in the 9th position of the contract number. You know it's a prototype if there's a 9. If it's a follow-on, it's probably a 9, and you have to figure it out and you have to read the agreement. Otherwise, you won't know. So it's been really hard to distinguish it and to show that things are moving on to follow on. And I think it's the same problem that we see with other programs like SIBRs or cooperative agreements, grants. There's not a lot of strings being pulled to show the connection between the agreement that may have funded something all the way to the procurement contract. So like if someone, for example, used the prize authority and has a program of record, it's really hard through documentation to show that unless people share that story. So having someone bridge that gap and put those things together, those are some of the stories that I'm collecting now. But it's been really hard to find and takes a lot of digging and a lot of reading because companies change, product names change, solution names change. And as they're being further developed, they might turn into something totally new. So something that might have been funded for research and development might have now turned into 12 different things. But I think the most popular one that everyone uses is the COVID vaccine. So if there's one that you can hang your hat on, it's the COVID vaccine. That one went through all the stages, was the OT authorities was used for it. One of the largest DoD OT agreements was written for the COVID vaccine. It was in the billions. So there's a lot of good stuff there, but we need to track those success stories and figure out how to better report on it, because right now it's kind of a mystery.
Amber, we can add that to our list of complaints next time we're talking to the government about their data. I'm making a note.
So a little bit about this book. I know I've talked a little bit about it already. If you have questions or need any resources, please email info@rexata.com. I'll send you everything. Amanda, Amber, and Haley, I'll send you guys stuff as well that you can share to help folks if they're looking for information. This book, it's less than 100 pages. We want it to be read. We want it to be a resource. Making it too long automatically makes it, a really nice backdrop to your video calls. So making it something that you can easily stick in your bag or have on your desk is really important. And I know everyone at the Pulse knows this. Institutional knowledge and understanding why something is written the way that it is really key. Because there's a vast difference between policy formation and policy implementation, because we all interpret the language differently, which is what makes OTs such a great case study and such a great application of that knowledge, because everybody reads the statute differently. Everybody makes decisions off of it differently. So if I had to give a helpful hint on this one, make sure your contract agreement file is solid. You have all the documentation in there, because legal changes, your contracts teams change. So knowing what your justification for why you chose an OT is really, really important.